So let's go ahead and jump right in. Welcome to those who are joining us. I'd like to introduce Ferry. Ferry Heilemann is a serial entrepreneur, a climate activist, and impact investor. He is obsessed with bringing our planet back on a sustainable track for future generations, thankfully. In 2009, he co-founded The Daily Deal together with his brother Fabian and sold to Google after only 2 years. His climate action journey began in 2015 and evolved from changing his personal lifestyle drastically, which Ferry will tell us about today, to making his company Forto climate neutral and co-founding the Leaders for Climate Action, which scales climate action for businesses, and ultimately moving from CEO to the board at Forto in 2020 to dedicate all of his time, energy, and resources to fighting climate change. The instrument he has chosen to fulfill this purpose is Pirate Impact Capital, through which he invests his private funds in mission-aligned founders, building companies creating significant impact in the areas of environmental sustainability and social equality. So welcome, Ferry. It's quite an impressive resume.
Thanks a lot, Courtney, for having me.
Absolutely. We're excited to have you here today to help us understand what startups can be doing in terms of environmental management and climate action and getting started right away, even if they're an early stage company.
Yeah, perfect. Sounds very good. I brought a couple of slides and will first of all give you again a little bit of my entrepreneurial background and some more details on the climate action journey that I personally chose, and that I mean, in the end, it looks like it's all very connected, but it happened in that way. And then I'll talk briefly about impact investing, and then I want to introduce Leaders for Climate Action and also close with several actions, concrete actions that you can take in your company on different levels. Yeah. So this is a very first impression, the very first company I actually did with my brother. It's a French pastry that we basically imported from France at age 15 and 19 and sold on trade fairs in Germany, which was a very profitable business from the beginning on, but not very scalable and very hard work. After studying business, we then co-founded Daily Deal, as mentioned by Courtney already, and scaled the company to more than 300 people in less than 2 years. And we're then fortunate to sell the company in 2011 to Google, also meeting this gentleman here in the middle. We then spent some time with Google. I was also in Mountain View for a while, starting to also create Google offers, which in the end didn't quite turn out as Google planned to. And we then bought the company back in 2013. This was our manager from Germany. This was basically 5 a.m. In January 2013 in the Google office in Berlin. Everyone was very happy. My brother and I had our entrepreneurial freedom back, and Google was also happy that we took over the company again.
That's an amazing experience to have at a young age like that. You know, it's kind of every entrepreneur's dream in a way. Can you tell us a little bit about what Daily Deals did?
Sure, absolutely. Daily Deal was an online platform that sold coupons with a 50% discount. So basically a marketing platform similar to Groupon that many of you have maybe heard about. And that way we basically created demand for local restaurants, local sports facilities, but in the end also started entering the travel business, etc. And we're basically breaking through the wall of online marketing for offline stores and shops. And today that is completely normal, but back then, 2009, 10, 11, you were mostly doing online marketing for online shops and not online marketing for offline shops. And this model was basically breaking this Chinese wall and got pretty powerful, was generating lots of revenue. But to be honest and open, it was a bit inflated, I would say. I mean, by now one can also read about the Groupon story, etc. Nevertheless, a very helpful and efficient tool for the local merchants.
So interesting. And this was influenced by your first experience with your pastry business. Is that correct?
Not so much, to be honest. So the pastry business was led us on the path of becoming entrepreneurs. So my dad is a psychologist, our mom an elementary school teacher, so we don't have kind of the entrepreneurial roots in our family or family business. Nevertheless, we decided, hey, after studying, my brother studied law, I studied business. We kind of thought, hey, what was actually really fun in our lives, and what do we want to do going forward? And we then kind of remembered the time of selling French pastry, but basically it was an entrepreneurial thing that we did, and that we actually really liked the freedom, some risk, but also the upside, and therefore decided then to become entrepreneurs. And without kind of money from your family, the digital space obviously is the most efficient way of doing that. So when we then basically screened deals, we're talking to a lot of people and we're looking for ideas, developed some own ideas. And my brother actually saw Groupon when he was in Stanford for a summer course of entrepreneurship in summer 2009. And we thought, hey, that's compelling. We can identify with it. It's simple. It's not that tech heavy, not having a tech background. And then we just gave it a go.
Amazing.
Cool. So then after buying back again, we had to restructure quite heavily, which was not easy. But we managed to turn the company profitable after another kind of 2 years, and then sold it to a German player who was complementary and active in a similar space. And then in 2016, I co-founded Forto, which is a digital freight forwarding business, moving containers and pallets from Asia to Europe, from Europe into the world, managing everything through a digital platform, creating more transparency, in the end also more reliability through automation, and making the whole process also much more efficient for the user, so the business user. And Forto also grew quite a lot. We are by now more than 650 people, raised more than $300 million. But I actually decided to step back from the CEO role last summer and focus full force on fighting climate change and contributing in that area. And that decision, again, I mean, it's pretty far from moving containers to fighting climate change, almost contrary, yeah, one could say. And that decision evolved over time. And my personal climate action journey actually started in 2015, when I started reading more about the climate crisis, learning more about it, and then also started taking action on a personal level. So I, changed my nutrition, became vegetarian. I switched to a renewable energy provider, implemented LED, put solar onto the roof, sold the combustion engine car, did a lot on the personal level, and also reduced flying quite a lot. So I'm down to 7 or 8 tons pre-COVID on a personal footprint. And to me, after learning about it, it became clear that the climate crisis is basically the biggest challenge that mankind is facing, not just in this decade, but actually in this century. And at the same time, it is also the most important one, because if we don't get this one right, we're literally burning down our own house, and it's really difficult to reverse that later on. So,
yeah. And can I ask you, Ferry, how do you actually measure your own carbon footprint as an individual? Is there a platform that you use?
Yes, there are several platforms that you can use. One is, for example, from the German Ministry of Environment, where you in the end put things in things that I just mentioned, like what kind of diet do you have, how big is your flat, when or house, when was it built, what energy provider do you have, how much do you travel, how many flights, etc. How much do you spend for general consumption? And there are different levels. Some take just 5 minutes, but you can also invest 15 or 20, and they then provide you with your footprint. And for us, high level, you can say that mobility, so basically moving, takes a lot of energy. The energy we're using is fossil fuel based, and therefore flights, for example, have a pretty big impact. So to make it concrete, one flight from Frankfurt to San Francisco and back in economy is roughly 4.5 tons of CO2. The average German is emitting 11 tons per year, all in. The average American is a little bit above, yeah, maybe 16, 18 tons, yeah. And so you see by this ratio that 4.5 tons for one single flight is almost 50%, or depending on the baseline, but makes up quite a lot.
Yeah, that's
And
like 75% of what you're doing in a year, as you
yes,
said.
exactly. So essentially, I don't fly to San Francisco anymore.
That's significant. That's significant. I think one of the challenges with measuring carbon footprint is knowing which tools are giving you a really good output and good information.
Yeah, absolutely. And
There are many out there.
yes, unfortunately I can't give you really a good one in the US. I haven't done it in the US yet, but I'm sure that they are out there. And if you Google a carbon footprint calculator, I'm sure you'll find several that can be used to do that. Yeah. The getting back kind of to the my climate action journey, the second step was then taking those thoughts and learnings and basically implement them also in my company, Forto, which we founded in 2016. That was still an early stage of my journey, and trying to apply the same thoughts that I basically did on my personal life also in the company. Yeah, and I will dive deeper into that later on. But by now, sustainability is really one of our core pillars, despite the fact that we're a logistics company. Yeah, we weren't founded with the idea of reducing carbon dioxide, but we are in an industry that is emitting a lot. Yeah, logistics, moving containers, air freight, etc. And so, in other words, we're also in an area where we have a certain lever and can actually do things in a better way or in a worse way, and can create an impact there. And that's what we are trying to do by now, also in the context of Forto. The third step was then basically from self to my company to as many companies as possible. And that was the foundation of Leaders for Climate Action, a community that drives climate action and where entrepreneurs are committing voluntarily to reducing their footprint and also compensating their footprint on a personal level, but also and especially on company level. And more details will follow later on, but the organization really scaled pretty well. And it's a non-profit with only 5-6 people full-time, another 10 supporting part-time, but created quite some impact already. And the last step was, yeah, Courtney?
Can I ask you real quick, Ferry, going back to your Forto experience, I'm curious. So you started with bringing your own personal values and concerns about climate change and that conviction. And so those small changes you told us about, like going vegetarian, et cetera. How do you think that affected your leadership? And, you know, we have a lot of startup founders in listening to this. What benefits did you see with your overall leadership, or how people reacted to you once you brought those values into the workplace in a more formal way?
Yeah. So actually, I have to say that the resonance was very positive. And an early step that I did was actually founding kind of a climate action group within the company. And people could, so I asked them, okay, hey, if you want to be part of this, you know, if this is of interest to you, I was asking people to put maybe 2-3 hours outside the normal work hours into this, in finding ways how we can optimize our footprint and we can become better and implement it into the product, etc. And actually 15, so like every 6th employee became part of this group. So kind of I think
That's
I actually hit a nerve. You know, a lot of people, especially, I mean, the startup scene, I don't know, average age is probably around 25, 30, something like that. And all of this generation is very aware of the topic. And I think, and that was 2017, 18, I think today, also after the Fridays for Future movement, etc., the awareness is basically all over the place, and people feel a much bigger urge to act on this. And what I also found out is that it gives an additional purpose, or actually, from my perspective, it is the ultimate purpose. A lot of companies that are founded because it's a good business idea, they need to seek for some kind of purpose that they then try to implement and put into the business. But this topic, basically saving our planet and making it also livable for future generations, is, from my perspective, the biggest purpose you can possibly have. And it really aligned a lot of people in the team and created a lot of motivation.
That's great. I love that advice and your approach with that.
Thanks. Yeah, and the fourth step was then basically, and that was obviously a pretty big decision, really stepping down from the CEO role, from the co-founder CEO role. Investors weren't very happy about that, but I found out that, hey, if I have 10 minutes free time, I think about climate tech, I think about sustainability. I didn't think anymore about logistics that much. And that by definition told me, hey, I'm not the best CEO for this company anymore. And we managed to do a good transition, and one of my co-founders took over the CEO role, and the company keeps developing in a very good way. But that was really a big step to say, okay, I can't do only 20% of sustainability anymore. I actually have to dedicate all of my time into this. Yeah. And here, I was also able to give a brief TEDx talk in 2019. And after I kind of moved out of the operational day-to-day business, also wrote a book on climate action, a climate action guide for entrepreneurs, basically, which will soon also be available in English. At the moment, only in German, unfortunately, but you can already earmark it. So now, after that, the next topic and the instrument that I now chose to do that and to have a positive impact is actually impact investing. And I just want to go briefly into this, and then we move on to Leaders for Climate Action, Concrete Action. So we basically rebranded our family office and are now focusing on inclusive impact investing through Pirate. And this is not just, or basically the higher level thesis behind that is that we actually need a shift, a transformation of the capitalism that we have today, which is basically a financial capitalism focusing on one aspect, namely on profit. And we need to move it to a capitalism that includes people and planet, and also profit, but especially people and planet into this equation, and therefore creates a more holistic and also sustainable result. And with Pirate Impact, that's basically our contribution to this transition. It's obviously just a small piece, but that's what I think is really needed at the moment. Because if we think or take a step back and think about the capitalism that we're living today, which brought a ton of positive things to us, a lot of development, a lot of wealth, and had many positive aspects to it. From my perspective, it by now actually reached the tipping point and turned rather into a liability and isn't really an asset anymore, because two things are really being disregarded. And one thing is the climate crisis, and the other thing is social disparities. And it's essentially an accounting failure, one could say, because costs that do occur through emitting a ton of CO2 are not taken into account in our current system. They are simply being ignored. And the real cost, taking health issues, destruction of the environment, also natural catastrophes into account, is roughly 200 euros. So basically, for emitting a ton of CO2, we're creating a damage and costs of 200 euros. And these external costs are not taken into account. If we would take them into account, our economy would look significantly different. Yeah? And in order to really sustain, I think we need to take that into account, and also the aspect of social disparities that are not, and this is just not being done by the current system. And we basically want to create a system that is really a transformed capitalist system that inherently pushes environmental sustainability and also social justice and enables people to have a more fulfilled life, and and not quite the way it is at the moment, with a pure focus on profits. And so we do that through
Barry,
investment.
can I ask you a quick
Yeah,
question? Sorry to interrupt
absolutely.
you. I'm really glad that you brought in the social disparities piece. We had spoken about this earlier. It really highlights that that climate change is also a policy issue, not just environmental issues. And can you give us some examples of what you mean when you say social disparity from climate change? And I think that sometimes when we talk about climate justice, that can feel really far away for people. It can feel like island nations that will be underwater in 10 years. And sometimes it's hard to, even though you care about that as a person, it can be hard to connect with that immediately and see how that might be associated with your business. But how is that close to home for a lot of startups?
Yeah, yeah, that is indeed a good question. Also, not easy to answer. The the social impact that we're pushing. So our focus is 80% on climate tech and 20% on social impact. It is not social impact that is directly or necessarily connected to kind of climate justice or to the climate issue. It is rather about creating, it's a couple of educational things and creating more equal opportunities. So the investments, and again, it's 80-20 focus, the investments we've done so far are rather in the educational space, enabling people, for example, from developing countries to learn coding skills that can then be applied in remote jobs for companies in the first level, enabling them to triple their income. Things like that, not directly connected to climate, to be clear here. And yeah, I think it's totally correct what you're saying. Yeah, the climate justice piece is really difficult, and it is far away and not easy to relate to it. But at the same time, I think it's also very important and good to know that even though it might even hit harder a couple of islands in the southern hemisphere, in the end, the climate change is a global thing, and in the end, no one can kind of run away from it. Yeah, I mean, this summer we had a huge flood catastrophe in the middle of Germany, and
Yeah.
many people died, and billions of damage was done. And I think that was a good example. Very bad. I mean, it's a horrible thing, but it's a good example that no matter where you live, the change that we're creating here will hit you. And yeah.
I recently saw, I think it was earlier this week, a study that was highlighted by CNN, and I can't quote which study it was now, but it said the estimates of people affected by climate change are actually much lower than what we believe. About 85% of the world has been affected by climate change already in some way, shape, or form. So it might not be a major catastrophe, but some sort of effect on your life. So that just made me think with our conversation today, it's reasonable for every startup to assume that their customer base and potential market opportunity is already being affected by climate change, and understanding those effects is beneficial.
Absolutely. So that for one, and the second aspect is obviously also regulatory change that will come. Yeah, that is also triggered by the pressure of the whole system, and taking that into account and rather being ahead of the curve in that regard is also very helpful, I think. So here a couple of companies, our portfolio companies aren't public. We've done some 15 investments so far. This is just an example of a couple of ones. So solar, for example, is in the end enabling the deployment of solar energy on private homes. Planetly is carbon accounting, the topic we mentioned, we talked about briefly before, measuring your footprint on scope 3 according to the greenhouse gas protocol in order to know what you're actually doing and where you can optimize. Charm Industrial is a carbon removal company. that are actually using a pyrolysis process to create bio oil and store it underground. And Sono Motors is creating EVs, so electric vehicles that have implemented solar panels and that are actually self-charging EVs based in Munich. Yeah. Good. But now let's move on to Leaders for Climate Action and also get to the concrete action after that. So as mentioned briefly before, Leaders for Climate Action, a community that we started a bit more than 2 years ago, by now active in more than 20 countries. And we're in the end uniting people in creating climate action on the one hand side and reducing their footprint, and on the other hand side also spreading and multiplying their impact. Yeah. And what we found, and also what I recognized, is when I back then 2018-19 talked to people, a lot actually said, yeah, on an intellectual level, I understand, yeah, we should do something, but in reality, not much happened. And it was always a priority B topic, and not urgent, didn't exactly know how to do it, and then it just didn't happen. And this is even an official study from 2019 that says it's not just for startups the case, but it's obviously also in the rest of the economy the case. And that's why we found Leaders for Climate Action. We thought, hey, let's build a community that actually turns those people into change makers, and let's enable people to act on this very important topic. Yeah. And how it functions is first the personal pledge. So whoever becomes a member is measuring his or her personal footprint, and we even developed an own calculator in order to do that. Is then nudged, let's say, to reduce the personal footprint in order to lead by example and also to create some awareness. Yeah, but again, no one can go from 100 to 0 within a day, because our whole system is still based on fossil fuels. So it needs to be a step-by-step process that we follow here. And this again is more for awareness than for the absolute impact. But the second a piece of the puzzle, the company pledge, is then more powerful. And here within 6 months, companies are measuring their footprint. We have several partners at hand that can do that. Is then starting to embark the journey of reducing the footprint. And this again is a process that will take, that can't be done within a day, but it's rather an endeavor over, depending on the company size, over maybe half a year or several years. And then also compensating the rest of the footprint through certified gold standard or VCS certificates. Yeah. Again, this is never the ultimate goal. It's something, it's a good milestone. It is better than doing nothing, but the goal always must be to reduce the primary emissions and only compensate what you cannot reduce yet. Yeah. And so those are basically, that's the core commitment that companies give, and the action that we are triggering, and we are supporting them in taking the action. We have guidelines that we created in general for companies, but also are starting to do that now for specific industries like e-commerce companies, etc. And we're basically facilitating the climate action to a great extent. We're also creating a community feeling. And the third aspect is that we are holding people accountable, because there's a yearly reporting, and again, measured on a yearly basis, the overall footprint and the development. And so that's basically one area of our action, is the operational companies.
And can I ask you a question about that, Ferry?
Sure.
What's the kind of makeup, the constitution of that network? Is it a lot of early stage companies, later? What do you see in certain industries that are joining more than others?
So in terms of company stage, it is very broad. Like, we have companies that have 20, 30 employees and say, hey, this is great, I want to be part of it. We also have a badge for members that, says, hey, I'm kind of climate neutral, I'm part of Leaders for Climate Action. At least in Europe, it is already known to some extent by now. But it ranges from relatively small companies up to I think the biggest member we actually have is Delivery Hero, which is a public company by now, listed in the DAX, in the biggest German stock exchange, with some 30,000 employees by now. Yeah, so that's basically the range. And we have more than a dozen of unicorns in the set. So it's pretty broad. We started at the beginning more or less top down, trying to get kind of the big names and the big brands into it, and then you're creating kind of a pull effect, and by now it's more than 1,400 people that are actually part of the community.
That's great. And what percentage of that approximately is outside of Europe?
So we have not that many yet. Yeah, I would say maybe 10%, 10-15% is outside of Europe. We have a chapter in Turkey and a chapter in Australia. We're not fully active yet in the US, but as also mentioned in one of our earlier talks, are looking and want to do that, because we haven't seen a similar network or community yet in the US, and think that this facilitation and also being an accountability partner is very important for this journey, and can really trigger the action that is needed.
And I just want to take this opportunity to invite anybody who has questions for Ferry when we get to the Q&A at the end of this talk, to submit them in the chat or in the Q&A. There's already some great questions in there, and we'll get to those at the end of Ferry's presentation.
Cool. Okay, so that's the one part, as mentioned, is the basically the operational companies, operational startups that can change their emissions and their footprint, etc. And the second part, and that was basically, or the second part of our network, is the venture capital scene. But again, here it's 10 guys investing 250 million. So, getting those 10 guys to climate neutrality doesn't really move the needle. It's not such a big deal. But what is their superpower? It's actually the money they invest and the influence, again, they have on companies and startups that have many more employees than the organization of the VC itself. So we created a clause that is actually being implemented into the SHA that just states that the company, the portfolio company of the respective VC, needs to measure, reduce, and compensate their footprint, and report this process also to the board. Yeah, so it's basically pushing more and more people into this, and it is formalized in the SHA. But so far, my experience is that most companies are actually open to do that. Yeah, you don't need to apply a lot of force, but it's pushing people a little bit over the finish line to actually get them going. And here we have, by now, it's actually more than 50 VCs that are actively using this clause. And the total money they're currently investing is more than $6 billion in the current funds, not overall AUM. So, and with that, we're kind of closing the gap in the venture scene, and I'm basically moving forward to our goal to turning the whole digital scene climate neutral and becoming a driver for climate action. Good. But besides that, so that is the concrete climate action that is kind of in our circle of influence. We're also doing more community action in different areas. Yeah. For example, we're using the group of investors and the name and the companies that are behind Leaders for Climate Action to send signals towards the politicians. Yeah, telling them, hey, look, the digital industry actively wants, we want effective climate legislation, and I mean, in the end, this is the progressive part of the economy, I would say. Yeah. At the same point, some industry action. We've also already formed alliances between several companies from the same industry that then use their basically their combined buying power to change their partners and their supply chain. Yeah. And we've also, I mean, the finance part I just mentioned, and the Green Week we did this year, for example, also together with Spotify, amongst others. We had more than 250 companies who participated in that, and pushed their consumers and in case of Spotify, that's dozens of millions. Overall, it's hundreds of millions to take concrete climate action. For example, switching immediately on a separate a page that we created to a renewable energy provider, or sending an email to your local politician, raising the topic of climate change to them again. So it's different community actions that we're doing within this group that can extend our influence that we have. And here again, the numbers, so a bit more than 2 years old, and basically managed to reduce and compensate close to 900,000 tons of CO2, which is of course much more than you can save with a single flight that you don't do. Yeah, so pretty happy, and we have overall more than 170,000 employees in the whole network, and it's still continues to grow pretty quickly. Now let's move to concrete climate action that you can take also in your company. Yeah, and I differentiated here between 3 different levels. One level is kind of your operations, your office, everything you have like very directly under control. The second level is your product. So how do you implement environmental sustainability into your product? And the third level again is how can you go beyond the border of your company? Yeah. And on the first level, so on your company level, there are a few things. I mean, there are many if you want to go into the details, but there are a few topics that are easily that you can easily do. One thing is electricity. So who is actually your electricity provider? Can you switch to one that is only creating renewable energy and therefore reduce your footprint? Yeah. The average emissions, for example, for 1 kilowatt hour of energy in Germany is roughly 500 grams. So depending on the size of your company, you can actually save quite a lot. And usually there isn't even a different cost. Yeah. Second aspect is also, and that's a bit more difficult to change, but heating system. Yeah. What kind of heating system is being used in your office? Can you influence the landlord to change that? For example, at Forto, we had some 2,000 square meters, overall 25,000 square meters building. I talked to the landlord for such a long time that he ultimately decided to switch the energy provider for the whole building. Yeah, took me.
Was that all it took? Just bothering him?
Yes.
Continue to go to him. Okay, there we go. That's good advice for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I told him, hey, look, the topic of climate change is super relevant, and you can either be kind of a progressive landlord and move forward and show a certain commitment, and I'm sure all of your tenants are not going to mind it, but are actually going to be in favor of it. And so it took a bit of convincing, because he's almost 70, but he ultimately did it, and it even changed it not just for us, but for many other companies. Yeah. So energy is one important aspect, and understanding and choosing the right energy provider is very important. And heat, the same thing holds true, but it's more difficult to change. Yeah. A second topic is travel. Yeah. And there you can think about the travel policy. So first of all, actually, it's about traveling less. And I think COVID showed that we do not need to meet everyone in person every single time. Yeah. And that we can actually also use Zoom or another a method to interact. And obviously some personal interaction is good and healthy, but I think the level of commuting and traveling that we had pre-COVID was, again, maybe not super healthy. And it's not just saving you costs, it's also saving resources and a lot of time. So adapting your travel policy and really rethinking, do I really need that meeting, first of all? And second, if I travel, with what mode of transportation do I travel? Again, the US is very big, so there's a lot of flying. But for example, at Forto, within Germany, we're only taking the train. So if it's up to 5 hours, we're in the train. If it's beyond that, obviously, at some point, it's not feasible with the train anymore. So travel is a big and relevant topic on your company level. And the third is basically food, nutrition. The overall food supply chain is roughly 20 to 25% of the emissions if you take everything into account, from producing the food, processing it, cooling it, transporting it, etc., etc. Yeah, and cattle is a huge part. So we moved to a plant-based diet that is seasonal and local as far as possible. Yeah, and on top of it, another benefit is it's more healthy. Yeah, the amount of meat that we're consuming is not even healthy. It's really unhealthy actually. So it's a very useful step, and yeah, for several reasons. So that is kind of the easy start. I change kind of my office setting, yeah, and do some action there. The second part, the product level, is much more powerful. Yeah, depending on the size of your company, obviously, depending also on what product you have, if it's a purely SaaS service, yeah, or if you're actually interacting with the real world. This is difficult to generalize. Yeah, you need to do it a bit more individualized depending on the company. Here, an example, what we did at Forto. Our product, obviously, totally in the real world, and having a big impact and quite some emissions connected to it. Yeah, even though, I mean, we're asset free, we don't own anything, but we are the freight forwarder that is kind of in charge of connecting the dots, and the customer is buying the service from us. We again are buying then slots on the container ships, etc. Yeah. And the first thing we did was we created transparency, because no one even knew, okay, I move a container from Shanghai to Hamburg. How much is it actually emitting? Yeah. And so it took us a while, but we found data providers and implemented that information into our platform and into our booking channel. And when customers say, hey, I want to move 5 containers from here to there, I get different offers. And those different offers now show the different emissions that are being emitted. And therefore, it becomes part of your decision process. And you get the chance to even choose routes that are more efficient from an emission standpoint. Yeah, that's the one thing, transparency. And that leads actually to the second thing, choosing the right transport mode. Yeah, and here you have a main run, which could be container ship, but it can also be rail or air freight. Air freight being basically 30 to 40 times as bad from an emission standpoint than ocean freight. Yeah, even though ocean freight has a relatively dirty image, in terms of how much do I emit per ton of weight that I move over 1 kilometer, it's extremely efficient. Yeah, and 30 to 40 times better than moving something with an airplane. Yeah. So the transparency leads to the right transport mode, and that way we can already reduce 10, 20, 30% of the emissions, depending on the cases. Yeah. And third, we then also started offering the customers, hey, okay, we know you still, it's part of your business. You have to move stuff from China to Europe, yeah, because that is where you're producing. We can optimize that to some extent. And what you can't optimize or don't want to optimize in some cases, we can compensate. So we also offered that as a product on our platform that customers can directly book with us, and we take care of the rest. And by now, actually 50% of the containers that we're moving are being compensated. And the great thing is that we're basically doubling the compensation. So whenever a customer decides, okay, I'll compensate 1 ton of CO2 here for this container, we are adding another ton to it. So with that, basically, with our contribution, all of the container shipments we are delivering are at least compensated. Yeah. So that's the product level, and that was a concrete example from Forto. And the third level is basically scaling your impact beyond the direct circle of influence that you have. Yeah, looking at other stakeholders that you can influence or that you have a certain a connection to. Yeah, and for one, that is your employees. Yeah, and you can, first of all, inform them about the whole topic, raise this, bring this to their attention. And also can start a challenge, for example, on the commute to the work. Yeah, using your bike instead of a car, for example. And that's also what I saw, that when we kind of created the climate action group within Forto, many people got much more aware and said like, yeah, hey, actually, I this time I didn't fly, or I flew, but I stayed 2 weeks instead of a weekend, and reduced the amount of flights per year that I'm doing. plus I'm compensating them now. Yeah. Another group is customers, and here again, you can nudge them into the right direction. Yeah, you can create transparency to enable their decision making, and hopefully allocate dollars into the right direction. Yeah, supporting, basically moving their decision making into the right direction. And a third level is partners, and that is yeah, basically people that you're buying products from, and that you are where you're allocating your money, and where you have a certain procurement power. And of course, if you're an early stage startup, you probably don't have that much procurement power yet. But if you combine forces with a couple of others, and we've seen that especially in the e-commerce space, for example, in the context of Leaders for Climate Action, you can actually say, hey, you can make certain asks to your suppliers. You can ask them, first of all, to report on environmental topics and on their CO2 footprint, and you can also ask them to change their products or materials that they're using that are more friendly. Yeah. So there's a multitude, and once you start working with that and start digging into it, you will find more ways how you can have an impact, and also go beyond your direct circle of influence. And being outspoken about the topic and raising it in whatever context you are is also a powerful thing. One more thing I wanted to mention is that when you start your climate action journey within your company, it's very good to have someone else besides the CEO doing it. Because as the CEO or co-founder, you're always fairly busy. And so having a climate officer who is close to you, who's reporting directly to you, but who has a bit more time to actually execute the things, is a super, super useful and important thing to have, I think. Yeah.
Awesome.
And yeah, I hope this was, yeah, you could take a couple of ideas and inspirations from this. And yeah, I think Antonio Guterres put it very nicely, that climate action is the barometer of leadership in today's world. Yeah, it's actually really what is needed at the moment for all of us. And no matter in what field you're active, you can certainly move the needle into the right direction here.
Great. Thank you, Ferry. I love that quote. I think it's very true, and it's up to us to make it true as well, as leaders of companies or whatever else we're leading. So thank you for this presentation and all the great advice for startups to implement today. I want to be really cognizant of time, so we'll just get to one question here at the end. Related to the Leaders for Climate Action clauses in the shareholder agreement. An attendee was wondering, are these clauses binding? Are they deal specific? And is there anything at the fund level for GPs or LPs? Are they agreeing to anything as well?
Yeah. So on the LP level, there is nothing yet that we've been doing. It's basically a commitment from the partnership of the fund. Yeah, and obviously we get the buy-in from the partners who think, okay, this is a useful thing. Let's do this. And obviously you need a buy-in from the whole group in the VC fund. In the SHA, that is why we're putting it really into the SHA and not just as a side letter, to make it as official as possible. Yeah. Is there a monetary penalty or anything connected to that? Not at the moment. Yeah. Yeah, that's basically where we stand. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like the overall approach is inclusion, right? You can use aggression or inclusion or a number of other tactics to bring people to the table. But right now, the inclusion sounds like it's been a very effective tactic, and is the direction that you're going in at this point with Leaders for Climate Action.
So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, inclusion, yeah.
And also the tactic that you've been successful with at your companies as well, just bringing people in, bringing them to the table.
At the same time, I think the great thing is that we are setting kind of a new standard, and we are creating a bigger and bigger mass, and that is creating a pull factor, and that is also creating new dynamics for companies that, or maybe also some founders that don't think it's so important, but by now their employees are actually saying, hey, this is important. We want this. Yeah. And there are studies that, or there's a study a year ago or so, more than 60% of the employees, for them, it's actually important or very important how their employer is kind of, if they take climate action or not, and what their standpoint towards the climate crisis is or not. So it is also an aspect for winning the best talent.
Great thing to keep in mind. Well, thank you so much, Ferry. It was great to speak with you today. And best of luck with all of these amazing endeavors that you're working on and leading. We look forward to seeing what comes.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Courtney, again for having me. Yeah, again, if you have more topics or questions, feel free to reach out. My email address is here on the bottom.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ferry. Enjoy your time in Hamburg.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.